The Chainwheel Diaries podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Bartley Berlin. Copyright Brian Bartley Berlin, all rights reserved. Available on Apple and Spotify. Welcome to episode 9 of the Chainwheel Diaries podcast. Stories about bike travel told by the travelers themselves. I'm your host, Brian Berlin. Today's episode features an interview with adventure cyclist Tim Tower, who has cycled thousands of miles through multiple continents and countries, including Latin America, South America, Greece, Europe, Africa, and the US. Tim documented his trips in journals he published on the crazyguyonabike.com website. Great reading for anyone considering long-distance bike travel. In fact, the entire site contains hundreds of bike travel journals. What I particularly enjoyed about speaking with Tim is learning about his other journey, learning Spanish and developing a love of Latin and South America and its people. And now, on to the show. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brian.
First, tell us about yourself. Who are you? Where are you? What are you up to these days?
Okay, just a summary. I was raised in South Africa, British parents. I immigrated here when I was 30, and then I met my wife here. We've been married for about 35 years. We live in Seattle, and we have been here since early 80s. So, cycling, so I started late in life. In fact, 2008 was a seminal year for me because I started learning Spanish, number one, and I started cycling longer distances. And both were due to my teenage daughter. She encouraged me in both. And I remember her coming in one morning on 2008 and said, "Dad, we've got to ride the STP." Now, not everybody would know what that stands for. It's well known in Seattle. It's Seattle to Portland bike ride, 203 miles, usually 2 days. There's some people who do it in one. I said, "Amy, you're crazy. I can't do 20 miles. How can I do 200? She said, "Dad, you can learn. Stop being so old." So she talked me into joining the Cascade Bike Club, a wonderful organization. They had 6 different groups of cyclists. I joined the slowest group, the red group. And lo and behold, I found they were nice to me. They didn't criticize my worn out Craigslist bike, for which I paid $60. And they advised me on what other bike I might want to buy. And from then on, I trained and started commuting to work, which is 47 miles round trip. I started doing that. Did the STP, and my whole life changed. My mileage came down from 12,000 miles a year in a car down to about 5,000, and I was biking more than I was driving. And the same year, when the economy crashed, I'd been wanting to learn Spanish because I wanted to visit Latin America. And I knew 4 words. I hadn't studied in school. My boss said, "Tim, we don't have much work for you. I'm an electrical engineer, but we don't want to lose you. So I hope you don't get bored, but later this year, we've lost a few contracts. So we'll just do kind of support service work." So I grabbed the moment and says, "Hey, can I have a couple of months off to go and learn Spanish in Guatemala?" You know, my boss's response was, "Where's Guatemala?" Oh, I explained to him. He says, "Okay, do that, but just make sure you're in telephone contact with us." So my daughter hooked me up with an immersion program in Guatemala. My learning Spanish has been one of the most wonderful experiences in my life. It was just wonderful. You stay with families who don't speak any English, and the kids will often take you on as a project. You know, it's nice to have some grown-up that they can teach. Oh, I loved it. It was such a cultural thing. Anyway, I studied at quite a few schools in Guatemala and Honduras, and my Spanish started improving. So then, as soon as I retired in the end of 2013, I decided I was going to hit Latin America. So kind of first thing I did was fly to San Diego with my bike and head across the border down Baja. I was a little nervous because it had a bad reputation, but you know what? These bad reputations are exaggerated. But anyway, so that's how I got into it. And then suddenly I found this is a marvelous. I don't ever want to take another tour in a car. So anyway, I ended up finally trying slowly, surely going through Latin America, through Central America, and then through South America, and finally reaching Ushuaia, which is the southernmost town, as you probably know, in Argentina, in southernmost town in South America. I arrived there just 2 weeks before COVID broke out. Nobody knew it was coming. It was like it was hanging over us, and I just got the flight back. Instead of taking one of these overrated, my opinion, overrated cruise ships down to Antarctica, which you can do, I decided I'd fly home. So I bought a ticket there, flew home, and then 2 weeks later, they shut down everything. So I've also done some cycling in Africa, South Africa, East Africa, cross part of the Sahara on my bike, cycled around Ethiopia, and I've done a bit in Europe. I'm not an expert at Europe, but my favorite was Greece. And I've done several trips, quite a few trips in the US, from here to Yellowstone, and several cross-country trips. So that's where I am with my cycling, and I just wish I could do it for another 10 years. One thing, I joined Adventure Cycling. Somebody referred me to Adventure Cycling, and they've been a great help.
Very much.
Especially, but they publish maps only for the United States. They're very good.
Right. Yes.
And I have a whole bunch of them. I have a stack full of them. So the first thing I thought I would do, and when the economy was slow again, it came to my rescue in 2011. I had my first trip down the northern Oregon coast. I had blogged that, and I was so nervous when I started. I can still remember wobbling down the pathway from the campground. We were camping as a family group, the mouth of the Columbia, and they all thought I was crazy. I was going to go over the Astoria Bridge, which had a terrible reputation, and then head down the coast. I didn't really know where I was going to camp. I'd heard that there were state parks. I did that. I met people. They took me under their wing. The cyclists were wonderful. I told them I'm a rank beginner. Tell me what to do. And by the time I'd done several hundred miles, I was heading back over the mountains to Eugene in Oregon. I said, this is just wonderful. I can do it. The next year, the work was still slow, so I pushed my luck with my boss. And I said, I can stay in contact with you, because I'd done well when I was in Guatemala, and he'd called me for help several times. He said, okay. I said, I want to cycle down to San Diego from Seattle. He said, what? Yeah. Actually, I've done that ride twice. This was the first one. It's a great ride. It's one of the classics in the world, probably, certainly in the United States, the Pacific Coast. I did a shorter version, partly for time reasons, in 2012. I went and repeated it with a blog, because I hadn't started blogging in 2012, but 2018, I repeated it, but in more detail. I went up to Vancouver and did the official long ride. I enjoyed it both times. I met a lot of nice people. Traffic sometimes is a little bit tricky. One had to be careful. So anyway, that's how I got my first ride. I got to San Diego, and I knew how to do that. What I didn't know in 2014 is what happened south of San Diego. It was much better than I expected. You are no doubt aware of Warm Showers, the hospitality group for cyclists.
I interviewed a Warm Showers host from Kutaisi, Georgia, the country, for episode 6, I believe it was. Marvelous guy. And Warm Showers hosts are the best.
It's worldwide. I've stayed with Warm Showers hosts all over the United States. It's through Latin America. I didn't do as much down in South America, but I've done it in Israel. I've done it because I cycled around Israel and Palestine one year. I've done it in Ethiopia and in the UK. Mexico is wonderful for Warm Showers hosts. They just love hosting people. You just need to speak some basic beginner level Spanish, and you can get by. The more Spanish you speak, the more you'll get out of it. So Warm Showers, I had a Warm Showers host, my very first, in Tijuana, It was great. They took me for a walk around the city. You know, a lot of the stuff we hear about these dangerous places are so exaggerated. And I encountered several cases of blatant exaggeration and errors, even on the part of BBC about parts of Mexico later on in my ride. Michoacan, for example, they condemned. And I did fine in Mexico. There was nothing wrong with Michoacan. Anyway, so then I started, and on that first leg, I went down to the tip of Baja. Then I took the ferry across the Mazatlan and then worked my way up across to Michoacan to see the monarch butterfly sanctuaries, which are a wonder of the world. And I just blew my mind being up there. And the hospitality and French friendliness everywhere was, it just put me at ease. I didn't have any negative experiences. So anyway, after that first ride, I couldn't wait to get going again. I mean, after I came back from Michoacan after 3 months, and I thought, these people are so nice. My Spanish is improving. I love the history. I love the kids. The kids are so much better socialized than in the US. When I think about the experiences with the people, they are really what stand out in my trips in the outside the US. Now, the question about Latin America is, how much Spanish do you need? You can do the whole route without knowing anything other than donde está el baño and cuánto cuesta. And you'll get by. And more English is being learned, especially amongst the young people. But if you're going to spend years cycling down there, which really is worthwhile, it's worth spending several months getting to advanced beginner stage, because then you'll really start to add to your Spanish. You need to have that basic training, because Spanish, I know what your level is, but I had none at school. I never learned it. You have to learn how to conjugate the verbs and have to learn about, the various genders, how it works. And once you get that idea, it's very logical. It's more logical than English. So I encourage people to try to find the time to go for at least a month, and maybe two, down Guatemala and Honduras are the two countries that are best value for money. Mexico is very expensive. Forget about Costa Rica. Way too expensive. And Ecuador and countries like that are too developed, really expensive. You need to stay with a family. You mustn't stay in your own apartment, and you need to avoid English-speaking people. Immersion, and you'll find your brain will get into gear. It'll say, I've got to survive. Therefore, I better start learning this. And the kids will, the kids love it. They love teaching you.
I bet. I just interviewed Kevin O'Leary, who referred me to you, by the way. He said that your documentation is awesome and inspiring. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But Kevin rode his bike from his home in Silver City, New Mexico, to Cancun on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico.
Good ride, I would think.
And I think it's fantastic. But the one regret he had was that he didn't have a command of the language, and it would have come in very handy on a tour like that. He did manage, and many of the people that he came across spoke a little bit of English. But that was his one regret, was that he didn't have a command of the language. And I love hearing you tell how you can get a big head start on gaining a command of the language, and it will only enhance travel in Latin America, especially on a bike, because you'll be looking for human kindness along your travels.
That is true. You also learn a few sentences. They are very polite, and they won't correct your Spanish unless you ask them. So you have to learn the expression for that. Say, corrígeme, soy estudiante del español. I'm a student of Spanish. Corrígeme, por favor. Please correct me. And they'll think about that and say, okay. And then you say, if they speak quickly, some of the times they speak very quickly, and you say, más despacio, por favor. A bit slower, please. And they are so flattered that a gringo or gringa is learning Spanish, because it's not common. We tend to be a little bit standoffish and think Spanish is only for those poor Mexicans who, don't have any education. That's not true. Yes, if you can learn some Spanish, it transformed my life learning Spanish. It was just wonderful. And it's also for the older folk like ourselves who retired, they say that learning a new language is a wonderful way to postpone dementia because it really gets your brain working.
So we've covered Latin America. You've done that. You've ridden across the U.S. You've ridden in other countries. Is there any one route or country that you did that really stands out in your mind? And then I want to segue into some of the people that you've met and what you learned from them.
If you want a civilized ride in Europe, bear in mind, I'm not an expert on the whole of Europe, although I've spoken to a lot of people. You can't go far wrong in Greece. I loved Greece and I would do that again. I would not do the Atlantic coast of Spain again, of France. And I'm not sure I would I cycled the part of the Camino de Santiago in Spain. The lower part from Sevilla up north, called Via de la Plata, wasn't that interesting. It was hard to talk to people. There was hardly anybody there. I felt a bit lonely. England was good. Ireland was just too crowded. So those are my thoughts. Greece is wonderful. If you go in April and May, you will get a wildflower show, which is hard to imagine. I met a group of Germans, half a dozen, with a tour guide who came there just to see the wildflowers. And accommodation in April and May, this was in 2018, was quite affordable, probably half to two-thirds of price in the US, Airbnb and Booking.com, and the same high standard. And then you've got those wonderful archaeological sites, which will, if you're halfway interested in history and how we came to be where we are today, the Peloponnesian Wars, it's a wonderful way to learn. So I would recommend Greece. You could just show up at Athens airport. You don't really have to plan a whole lot and just get yourself a guidebook. Yeah, I would recommend that. And also southwestern England, I thought was very good. Devon, Somerset, going around into Wales. Although I was going to go this past summer until I got sick. But it was really hard to find even camping accommodation at the youth hostels. It's got so crowded. It never was like that when I went through there in 2014. So maybe that's a post-pandemic problem. So that's one thought. My favorite ride of all, though, has been Latin America, especially South America. And when I keep on thinking about why, it's really the people, and then there's been some wonderfully remote scenery. And I'm not talking about single track stuff you can do with a road bike, but it's mind blowing, and you can get really far away from people if that's what you want to do. And it's nice to do that once in a while. The Andes are an amazing mountain chain. And of course, there's all kinds of flowers and animals that you can see. And Central America and Mexico were worthwhile too. I enjoyed those.
Because you're riding a bike across a country, through a state, through a city, you come across people, and you've come across many, and they're very memorable to you. So let's talk about some of those interactions, because I want my listeners to understand that touring a country or region on a bicycle puts you in direct contact with people more than if you were riding through there in an automobile. So let's talk about some of those interactions that you've had, that you shared with me, which I thought were excellent.
One example, I was cycling through Bolivia on my South American tour. By the way, I blogged that you can look at the date. It's 2019, 2020, South American tour. And I just come over the mountains to get back into the Altiplano, Bolivia. I was down in the lower coca growing country, which in itself was an interesting ride. But anyway, I'd gone over the peak, and it was a bit of a challenge. It was up at 15,500 feet, and you've got to be careful. You don't have a lot of energy up at that level. I was cruising down to this town of Conani. I stopped at a school just outside town because it had some very interesting murals, which were pro-environment. They were talking about protecting the environment. And while I was stopped, a teenage girl stuck her head out of the window on the second floor and said, "Hey, espera, espera. Queremos hablar contigo," which means, wait, we want to talk to you. She assumed I spoke enough Spanish. So I said, "Sí." So her head disappeared. Very soon, three of them came out. Maybe safety in numbers, but they weren't afraid of me. Three teenage girls, 17-year-old, and I told them, I asked them their names. They were Nancy, Alicia, and Ursula, and they were fascinated in what I was doing. There was nobody else around, just the three of us, three of them and me. And they wanted to know where I come from. I showed them Seattle on the map. Of course, they'd never been that far. In fact, few of these had ever been outside Bolivia, or the country where I met them. And then we talked about women's rights. They were really interested. And they loved it when I said we need more female presidents in this world because you ladies are more sensible, más sensatas. The word for sensible is sensata in Spanish. And I said in general, men act first and think afterwards. Or women think first and then they act. And they loved that too. I mean, they were my buddies. Anyway, I said I would include their photo, asked them if I can include their photo. I took a photo of the three of them in my blog, and they were so flattered. I have to add another one from Bolivia. And unfortunately, I can't actually find the exact day. I flipped through it and I couldn't find it. But I was going through on the Yungas loop, which is from La Paz to Conani. And I came into a poor village. It was all gravel and obviously poor. You can see it. And a few kids emerged from the woodwork, but they were a bit shy. They were like preteens, maybe 7 or 8. The girls were a little bit more ahead. And then I said, I started speaking to them in Spanish. And then one turned around and said, "Vengan, amigos, este hombre habla español. Come, friends, he speaks Spanish." And the kids emerged out of the woodwork. There must have been 15 or 20, half girls, half boys. The boys hung back a bit. The girls came forward. Here's what's interesting. They started asking me about my trip. So first of all, the boys asked various questions, and I posed this question to people I meet. What do you think the boys were interested in? There's a guy coming along on a bike, which is, different from their bikes. What do you think the boys were interested in? How do my disc brakes work? How many speeds do I have? The girls let the boys talk about this, and then several of them they were 8 or 9. What do you think the girls asked about? This is very interesting because it sort of summarizes the difference between us. One of them asked me, "Do you ever get lonely?"
Yeah.
So I said, not too bad because I can with WhatsApp. They knew about WhatsApp. Most of them had a phone they could share. And I can contact my wife and daughter. I showed them photos of my family. And then they said, "Do you ever miss your family?" And I said, "Sometimes." And then one of them asked me, "Does your family miss you?" How could I answer that one? I don't know. It was so precious. I mean, these are preteens in a poor little village. I wish I could have spent more time with them. I wish I could have had some classes, teaching them things. I showed them photos of where I come from. They had no idea what it's like in Peru or other countries. They had no way of doing that. So those are two stories which really stick in my mind, and those two happen to be from Bolivia.
You also list some stories about women cyclists that you've met that are doing long distance travel. One of them was going from Alaska to the tip of South America, like you were. Tell me about them.
Her name was she was a Dutch woman in her 50s who was a medical doctor, but had a year and a half, maybe 2 years sabbatical. And I met her when I was in 2018, when I was repeating my Pacific Coast route near Monterey. I saw her arrive put up her tent, and I thought I'd go over and talk to her. And I got to know her and said hi and found out where she was heading. We're going to South America. I thought, because at the time I wasn't doing South America. It was only the next year that I would do South America. So near Monterey. So I said, "Okay, well, really nice to meet you, Noor." She turned out to be actually an Olympic Uh, she was on the Dutch Olympic team for ice skating. She was really athletic, but she was on her own. She said she had started in I think Prudhoe Bay, or might have been Fairbanks, sometime before. Several friends and girlfriends had flown out to meet her and stayed a couple of weeks and then gone back home. But she was on her own and she'd come this far. So I thought nothing more about it. And I thought, what a nice woman. And I included a photo in my blog, which is in my Pacific Coast 2018 blog. Anyway, here's the story carries on, because after I got to San Diego, it was October, and I decided I still had time to cycle around the Grand Canyon. So I rented a car, threw my bike in the back, drove to Flagstaff, and turned in the car. There was snow on the ground already, and I thought, whoa, but it's a good ride. Anyway, I started on this, and I rode to the South Grand Canyon, the main center. It's not the north. It's not the north end. It's the south end, and they have a hiker biker site. Guess who I saw there? Nora was there, and I said, Nora, how did you get here? She said, I cycled through the Mojave Desert. I said, you didn't. She said, yeah, it had been tough, but she'd cut across south of LA and come all the way through the Mojave Desert. I said, Nora, you are amazing. But the story doesn't end there, because the following year in February, I headed down to South America. And I started in Ecuador, and I started cycling south, got into Peru, one of my favorite countries to cycle in. And I was, one night, I wild camped high up. I was over 14,000 feet with spectacular views. I was getting up in the morning, and I happened to look up on the road, and I saw two cyclists going by. I thought, well, that's interesting. I hadn't seen cyclists for a long time. Anyway, I packed up, pushed my bike up there, carried on a bit, and there they were. It was Noor and a Spanish companion she teamed up with. I said, Noor, what a coincidence. She said, oh, we've been following your blog. We knew roughly where you were going to be. So I got more photos of her up there. And then later on, we stayed in touch. She was much faster. The two of them I couldn't keep up with, and I didn't want to anyway. So Noor, I must write to her again. Noor Holspoor, and you can see her in if you look at day 62 of my Pacific Coast 2018 trip, you'll see photos of her and links to the two other times when I met her. The two other women whom I haven't met, but I've read about, which prospective women cyclists might enjoy looking at their blogs. The Bike Ramble by Fredrika Ek from Sweden. She spent 3 years cycling alone around the world, and she's got an excellent YouTube video. She's a humble woman who just says, I'm just an ordinary woman from Sweden. And she talks about the fun time she had there. So I thought that was pretty amazing. It's a huge distance she traveled, and she went through some difficult areas like Africa, West Africa. Not easy. There's a story about, I met a woman from, a psychologist from Switzerland. I met her on the Carretera Austral, which is down in Patagonia, the famous ride that goes through the Chilean fjords. And she'd been trying to go on a long trip for a long time, and all the men and her friends had been saying, it's too dangerous. You know, she's in her early 30s. Until suddenly she read the story about Fredrika Ek. That's how I find out about Fredrika. And within a couple of weeks, she was on the way. She said, bye, everybody, I'm gone. And there she was. We cycled together a few times. I met up with her. And she was just going down through South America and having a good time. There is one very interesting one, probably one of the braver young women I've read about. A Korean woman called Jin Jeong. And Jin Jeong, her blog is Traveling Around the World by Bicycle. And once again, if you Google Korean woman bicycle around the world, you'd find her. What impressed me most about her is she started in the US, went down to Brazil, which is a reasonable ride, but then she flew to Cape Town. Now, I grew up in South Africa. I know quite a bit about Africa, traveled there. And then she headed north on her own all the way the length of Africa. Now, that is a trip.
Mm-hmm.
much, much more challenging from the security point of view and also the climate point of view than South America. And she made it. Now, she got propositioned a few times and she just told them to get lost, and the men have listened to her. They didn't ever try to assault her. It's quite funny reading about it because her English is not her first language and she's very direct about what she writes. It's worthwhile looking at her blog, just dipping into it. And she made it all the way to Egypt, where the men were very, very forward, and she had to join a group just to stop their propositioning. And then she went to Europe and been doing all kinds of crazy things. Amazing story, Jinjiang. So I don't feel that what I've done is really that amazing, not compared to what these people have done. But for each of us, we have our own challenges, and the feeling of satisfaction of having done it oneself.
I think solo is the way to go. I think that if you're a solo rider, you are forced to reach out to people and engage with them. And I think if you're a solo rider, people want to reach out to you. In many of the conversations that you've had, that you've told us about today, if there would have been two or three people with you, it might not have turned out the same. And the
Correct.
people with you might have said, this is great, but I want to keep writing. I think that's one of the chief advantages. Can you add anything to that?
I wholeheartedly agree with you. People are intimidated by large groups, especially of foreigners, and it's much more difficult to relate to them because I've cycled with groups, not as a former member, but I've cycled distances with them just to see how they do. And it's much easier if you're on your own. People will approach you if you're in a store or whatever. I've had people come to me, actually. I remember when I was my first trip through Yellowstone from Seattle. I was in Montana and a lady came up to me and said, "Are you cycling? Do you have a place to stay tonight?" Well, it turned out I didn't. I was going to look for a wild camp. I love wild camping, but it can be primitive. And she said, "Well, we like cyclists. Why don't you come and stay with us?" And I just met her in the aisle in a supermarket. And it was great. I mean, I found a place to pitch my tent at their house, and the family was welcoming. So, yeah, but if there'd been three of us, I don't think that would have happened.
Right.
I've also noticed that there's usually in a group, there was a Dutch group, supported group going through northern Argentina, heading south. And I cycled them for a bit. They invited me to their camp, but I declined with thanks. There were two guys in front who were racing. They came blowing by me. It's quite a pretty area there. It's sort of starting to become deserty, but there are lots of very interesting plants. There were flowers out. There's no way they could have stopped or would have wanted to stop and look at those flowers, but that's part of the joy of it. And then also I noticed when other people came by and I cycled with them, they started feeling they were holding up the group. And there was pressure on the slower people to move it and not to complain and not to take a rest unnecessarily. I don't know if they were all enjoying it that much, whereas I stopped often and I showed up later at lunch and they offered me some of their food, and that was nice of them. None of them ever mentioned talking to the locals, because I think, for one thing, the locals were intimidated and the group members felt that it was inappropriate because, they'd be doing something out of the ordinary. I thought they were missing so much, but there are advantages because you can just pay your money and show up as long as you're reasonably fit.
I think you've pointed out the key differences between solo bike touring and group touring. You're 100% right about solo touring is at your own pace and stop where you want. As I mentioned, I just interviewed Kevin O'Leary, another bike traveler, and he would not ride the entire day. Many times he would start early in the morning and get to the town he planned on visiting in the early afternoon, get settled in a hotel, and then go out and visit museums and local places in the town he was staying instead of, burning rubber until dusk into another town. And I think that's marvelous. That's a great way to look at it. There is no real timetable unless you enforce one upon yourself. I want to put a plug in for your journals on Crazy Guy on a Bike. That's all one word, no spaces, crazyguyonabike.com. Just in the search bar, look for Tim Tower, Tower. The level of detail in your blogs is awesome. So as we near the end of this conversation, Tim, if you don't mind me saying so, you've experienced some health issues, and I think this has maybe hindered some of your plans to continue to do long distance cycling. So, what are your plans now?
Well, Brian, it's been very nice talking to you about this, and thank you for all your effort. Yeah, and contributions, because you've had lots of experience too. Yeah, it's hard. I really miss the people of Latin America. But what I, with my first Spanish teacher, who lives in Honduras, she's like a sister to me. I've known her since 2008, and we talk every Sunday. I've been sponsoring through her. She supervises sending some of the poor Mayan, Chorty Mayan girls who don't get to go to high school, trying to get them into the local high school. And the amount of money is not large. There's a lot of opposition from parents. Dads often don't think it's appropriate, which is so sad. But we've been trying to sponsor girls, and we're going to expand the program. We just got one girl now who's just loving being in high school. Previously, she didn't have the wherewithal. So that's given me a new interest. I wish I could go there more often. Going to Honduras is okay if you're well, but I have a liver problem, and now I've just got this fungal infection through an accident in the hospital, which has laid me low for almost a year now. I'm hoping to recover from that and then go back there. And I love the kids there. The kids are great. I really like to promote young women. So it helped me appreciate how well off I've been in my life. So that's something to do. And yeah, we'll take it from there. Just got to get a bit better and then head down. And I think my long distance touring is over, because you need to be physically well enough to do it like on a camping trip or a backpacking trip. You need to be in that kind of fitness. You don't need to be able to do 50 to 100 miles a day, as long as you can just do 20 to 30 miles with a loaded bike, and it takes time to build up to that. But as long as you can do that, you'll get fit on the ride. You probably notice you don't have to start off being super fit. You just build up slowly, and you'll get better and better. And after 2 weeks, your butt will stop hurting, and you'll just feel better. So I'm hoping that other people can do it. Do rides. I'd really like to encourage them. And if anybody wants to email me, they can just use the guest book on my blogs, and I'd be happy to help them with whatever. And
Tim, in your blog, I picked a phrase that you used. You said, I prefer experiences to possessions. I want to close on that. What you're doing in Honduras, very admirable. And I would like us to keep in touch. I want to understand your progress with that, and, share, some of the experiences you're having with that. But this has been a true joy speaking with you today, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
thank you, Brian.